All right, well, I'd like to welcome all of you today. Thank you for turning out for this. I know that it's supper time for many of you. For others, that you're beyond your bedtime, all sorts of things. But I thought it would be appropriate to put something together in commemoration of tomorrow's 50th anniversary of the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And we have today a really wonderful panel of speakers that will be contributing different aspects to the Kennedy presidency. Let me introduce everyone first. I'm Marie Natoli. I'm professor of science here at the college. It's Professor Lenore Martin, professor of political science, and Associate Professor William Leonard and Robin, and also academic dean. And camera shy is Professor Faina Rivkin from the chemistry department. I will present an overview of the Kennedy presidency. Bill will talk specifically about Kennedy's 1963 civil rights speech. Lenore will deal with foreign policy. And Faina is going to be talking about the Soviet perspective on that entire era. And then we'll roughly run for like 5 or 10 minutes each and then have time for questions and answers. Well, let me begin by saying that Kennedy presidency lingers with us. Now, there was a New York Times article last week that said, well, this is it. This is it. You know, the 50th anniversary is it. We won't be talking about this anymore. I don't think so. And the reason why I don't think so is because of how many things that particular presidency was. It was the first of many, many things. This was the first Irish Catholic to be elected to the presidency. As he noted in his inaugural address, he was the first president to be born in the 20th century. Of course, that would have been true if Nixon had won as well. But anyway, they're about a year apart in age, even though Nixon always seemed a lot older. You can see this on some of the slides here. And Kennedy, very importantly, was the first full-fledged television president, which is critical to understanding that whole period of time, particularly when you look at it and you can envelop his campaign during the primaries, then his campaign during the general election, his televised press conferences, and then at the other end of the parentheses, the actual assassination and that week-long funeral. It's little known that it wasn't until September of 1963 that we had a half-hour news broadcast. Until September, the news broadcasts were 15 minutes. And CBS took a gamble because their ratings were down and they went to a half-hour broadcast. The reason why I point that out is because that was in September, and in November we had a 4-day news broadcast. And as the late historian Theodore White said, forever changed would be the role of television in American politics. It became the instant gathering place of the nation. This was a very telegenic medium, a very telegenic presidency, I should say, and he knew full well how to use it. He was able to use those press conferences to go above the head of congressional leaders, to go above the heads of the Republican-controlled print media, much like Roosevelt had done with radio. And he knew how to use the photo op. My understanding is that to this day, this is the most photographed presidency we've ever had. It was irresistible. Young, attractive family, the kids in the White House, all of which led itself to the Camelot symbolism. Do all of you know the story about Camelot? King Arthur and Guinevere and the Knights of the Round Table, and everything was idyllic in Camelot. There wasn't too much snow, there wasn't too much rain, everything was perfect. And approximately a month or two before his death, the president actually said that Camelot was his favorite musical. So it became irresistible to put his presidency under that big umbrella. Go back to his inaugural address when he talked about the torch being passed to a new generation of Americans, the eternal flame at his grave. So this irresistibility, and at the end of Camelot, King Arthur, they're in battle because Camelot has fallen apart. He says to a young boy, take this message back. Let it not be forgot that for one brief moment there was a spot that was known as Camelot. And this is a major part of the legacy, this one brief shining moment. I have referred to this elsewhere as the end of the Age of Innocence, and in many ways it was, even though, as Lenore will talk about, Kennedy was very much involved in escalating Vietnam, not to the extent that Johnson did, but nonetheless he was. For many Americans, this was the end of trusting presidents. Kennedy's assassination had him, of course, followed by Lyndon Johnson, and then subsequently there was Richard Nixon. And Kennedy was the last president that infused in Americans a sense of idealism, a sense of trust, rather than the cynicism that followed Vietnam and Watergate. Besides that, many of his programs infused a sense of individualism and idealism. Think about the Peace Corps. You know, the Peace Corps, to date, it began in March of '61. To date, there have been 210,000 Peace Corps volunteers who have gone to 139 countries. Kennedy talked about this being a different kind of a war. You know, that we go with our bulldozers, not our tanks. We go to build, not to destroy. And so this was infusing a great sense of that individuals can make a difference. And for that generation that knew Kennedy, I think and I did, not personally, but I think we'll go to our graves believing that one person can make a difference. And you know, in thinking about these remarks, I'm thinking about, you know what? It would be impossible for us to talk about the pay it forward that has taken place. Let's just take those Peace Corps volunteers, 210,000 people touching so many lives, and those lives touching lives and lives and lives. So it's very, very difficult to figure out how much of an impact someone has had. It's endless. I think this is the way we're all ultimately judged by the end of our lives. How many people have we impacted? So there was that. He was also surrounded by the Cold War, and I'm going to leave a good deal of that to Lenore to speak about. Where was he in terms of other issues? Well, his legacy would say that he was a champion of civil rights. He really wasn't embodying civil rights. He was rather resistant in that area. But that said, as Bill will talk about, over the course of that summer of '63, something seemed to change. You know, after he did not want to have those freedom rides take place, but once they did, he started embracing civil rights in a way that he would never see to completion, but that his successor, Lyndon Johnson, would be able to. In other ways of looking at his legacy, I think we have to think about his rhetoric. The rhetoric was brilliant. I suggest that sometime you sit down and listen to Kennedy's speeches. Listen, for example, to the inaugural address. If anybody's interested in this, I've got a fantastic analysis that someone wrote about what he was attempting to do in that inaugural address and how he mastered that. But his speeches are all like that. They're brilliantly crafted. You know, he would always understand his audience. We talked about Lincoln in this regard the other day with the Gettysburg Address. Kennedy always knew his audience. Lenore is going to be talking about his trip to Berlin and his speech there. So if you start with the inaugural address that harkened back to his acceptance speech at the Democratic Convention during the summer of 1960, and you take it forward and look at his subsequent speeches, you see themes being built. Some of my favorite speeches are, besides the Berlin speech, his civil rights speech of 1963, his American University speech was a fabulous speech where he talked about peace and the importance of peace. He said, at that moment, it was at their commencement, he said, "Today, every inhabitant of the planet must confront the day when the planet might no longer be habitable. Every man, woman, and child is under a nuclear sword of Damocles, hanging by the slenderest of threads, capable of being cut at any moment by accident or miscalculation or by madness. The weapons of war must be destroyed before they destroy us." Let me make a correction there. That was at UN General Assembly. That was not the American University speech. At American University, nonetheless, he talked about, and he said, "One must it would help if I had these on. Okay. Now this makes sense. Wow, he said, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit the small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal. That was in June of '63. Rather poignant statement there. So, in concluding my remarks at this point, and we'll be able to take questions later on, let me say again that I'm happy to have you here. I'm glad to see the interest and you've been inundated over the last couple of weeks by Kennedy material. And I welcome the comments of our panelists. So we thought that Professor Leonard would speak next.
I think about that June of '63, and gave the American University speech on the 10th, and he gave the Civil Rights speech on the 11th. I think it was clearly a busy month for him, and where it shows that he was thinking and really trying to come to terms with some major issues facing not only the world, but as the country. I'm going to show you a clip from the speech in just a few minutes. About 4 or 5 minutes, because I think it's important to see the speech, hear the language, and hear it in his own words. As Marie said, Kennedy was rather cautious on civil rights. Most politicians were. There's probably very little difference between Richard Nixon and Kennedy in terms of civil rights in 1960. While Kennedy was a member of the Senate, major things were happening with regard to civil rights. The 1954 Brown decision had been handed down. 1955, you have the Montgomery bus boycott happening, and the rise of Martin Luther King as sort of the civil rights movement. You have the desegregation of Little Rock, Arkansas High School in 1957. All these things were happening. One of the other things that I noted when I was preparing for this was there's a very interesting exchange of letters between Jackie Robinson. Jackie Robinson was the first African-American into the major Dodgers. Played for the Dodgers, yes. And he played for about 10, I think it was 10 years, and he retired. And then he was probably the best known African-American in many ways in the country. And he gets into this letter exchange with Kennedy while he's a senator. He also gets an exchange with Richard Nixon because both of them want Robinson's endorsement. Robinson ends up endorsing Nixon. It's interesting to think about that. He doesn't think Kennedy, as a Democrat, is really going to be pro-civil rights. And we can talk about that afterwards. I mean, this is a very interesting sort of historical moment because the road to the White House for Democrats is through the South. That's the only way they'll win the White House prior to really the modern era. But another important thing that happens in 1960, right in the middle of the campaign, is Martin Luther King is arrested in Atlanta. And the Kennedy campaign had to deal with this. They didn't want to come out and say he should be released. They were being very cautious. They don't want to alienate the South. He needs those southern states to back him. But they let it be known that he gave a call to Mrs. King asking about his well-being. And Robert Kennedy, the president's brother, made a call to the judge and eventually got him out of jail. But he was extremely cautious, and for a lot of different reasons. And he was confronted when he became president and inaugurated with a lot of the lunch counter sit-ins were still happening throughout the South. They were only expanding throughout 1960 and 61. In the spring, the Freedom Riders took to the buses and caused quite a bit of issues for him. He had to intervene with federal marshals to try to protect some of the Freedom Riders, and sometimes they were successful and sometimes they were not. He dealt with the desegregation of the University of Mississippi with James Meredith. He was so cautious that, and he got a lot of criticism for this. Jackie Robinson and others wrote them, Roy Wilkins and others, members of the Civil Rights Movement. He had pledged he could desegregate public housing with the stroke of a pen. Well, he became president January 20th, 1960. It wasn't until late 1962 that he actually went ahead and did that. So he was extremely cautious. But the spring of 1963 saw some of the worst and most brutal violence in the civil rights. Birmingham, Alabama. And he witnessed that and he saw that. And I think it moved him to the point where he started to think we have to say something more definitive about civil rights in America. And on June 11th, 1963, the day some students were forcibly brought into and allowed to register at the University of Alabama, he defeated George Wallace in that sense that day, he gave an address. And I'm going to show you just the first 4 or 5 minutes from it, because I think it's really not an issue for North and South, for a moral issue for the whole country to have to grapple with. I would encourage you, the speech is about 13 minutes and a half long. This is on YouTube on C-SPAN. I would encourage you to see it. He goes on again about this moral question. And I'll end on this just saying to you that this is very different and why this speech is so important. If you look back, we talked the other day a little bit about Lincoln. Lincoln said when he became president, to save the Union, I will keep slavery. I have no problem with that, he said. I will keep, millions of people in bondage to save the Union. He didn't necessarily, he saw it as a political issue to preserve the Union. You see that over and over again. You saw it with Theodore Roosevelt wanting to invite Booker T. Washington to the White House. He does, but it can't be official, it can't be anything, it has to be done on the side. You see President Eisenhower talking, having to force the desegregation of Little Rock, Arkansas High School, and he says, the Supreme Court says I have to do it. Not because it's the right thing to do, but the court tells me to do. And I think that this speech and Kennedy's approach to this, and I think the effect, as Marie said, is really, it's going to be up to Johnson to make sure that this all becomes a reality. I'll just stop there, but we can take questions later.
I wanted to begin, I have to say that I want to begin with the beginning of this program because Dr. Natoli sent out this idea and I jumped at it. She said, we should recognize the 50th anniversary of President Kennedy's assassination. And memories just flashed in front of my eyes. The feeling of shock, feeling of loss. Everyone who was alive then, everyone will remember where they were, right? I can look at my colleagues who were alive at that time. We will all remember where we were. I was in my Russian history class. And, it's just, and Dr. Natoli mentioned this, but I'll mention it in a personal way. I was tied. We were tied to the TV. Ate in front of the TV. Everything was there. It was all there for us, which is what you were saying. There was no place else to go. You couldn't do anything else. It was a shock. And it was disbelief. And when you look, when I look at the family at the time of the funeral, if you look at those photos, you can't help but think that Jacqueline Kennedy couldn't really, have felt what was happening there. She did what she needed to do because we were all in a state of total shock. And I want to also say one other personal thing. President Kennedy, JFK, was the first presidential candidate I had worked for. I actually went, I'll never forget this, went to Manhattan all the way from Brooklyn and went to a phone bank and called people and campaigned for Kennedy. He actually came to my neighborhood, so I was out there among the trillions yelling, yay, yay, yay. It was a very democratic area. But he attracted many of the youth at the time, right? It was a very important. He was young, right? So we could identify. He was energetic. He had enormous, and you can see it in this clip. He had enormous charisma. He was handsome. He had a beautiful wife. He lived this Camelot, what we thought was a Camelot existence. The man was in pain every single day. He had Addison's disease. But the point was that he was young, and his message to us was that this was a new time and for a new generation. But when it came to foreign policy, it was neither a new time nor a new policy. And that's really what I'm now going to talk about for my next few minutes. See what happens. You give me the, But I'm going to try. The little message that I would take away, or that I hope you take away from this, is that John F. Kennedy was a Cold War president. Campaigned as a Cold War president. Just before his time, and Faina will talk about this, just before he comes to president, he's running for president, 1957, Sputnik, the first, sort of satellite goes up there. And we're sitting there looking at this, we are shocked, And just to give you an idea of how old I was in school, and high school, I think, at that time, and they changed our whole program for physical ed. We had to get going. We were just lazy people. And you youth, you have to get going. This is before Kennedy even. So, because the specter was that we were losing, this is why it's so important that Faina Rivkin is here today, because for us, it was that we were losing our edge in science and in military science. So that's 1957, before Kennedy comes to power. Then there was the other, he walked in 1959. We have the revolution in Cuba. So now, right in our own neighborhood, was the communist menace, right? So, and that's how we looked at this. So as he's campaigning, he is campaigning that we need, like this, we need a strong America. That was the message. But he said it with much more charisma than I just did. But it was there. We need a strong America. The major Cold War issues for him, he was left with them. Eisenhower leaves, and he's left with Cuba, right? He's left with Vietnam, because Eisenhower had put in a few hundred, the figure is about 500 U.S. troops in there. He's left with Berlin as, sitting on the front line. Germany, there's no peace sign there. He's left with us as, an arms race, okay? He's left with, an emerging Africa, and he's left with trying to bring Latin America closer to the U.S., and that's important now because we have this challenge in Cuba. So I'm going to talk very quickly about some of this. The first 4 months, he's now president, the first 4 months, he's faced with the CIA telling him about this invasion that had been planned under President Eisenhower. This is called the Bay of Pigs. I don't know if any of you have heard of this. And Dr. Tolley, I think, mentioned this very quickly. And of course, I'll sum it up. He failed. He said yes to it. He hadn't questioned it carefully enough. He hadn't brought together a whole group of people to discuss this. And he did have some input in it. He wanted it where it would be quiet, da-da-da-da-da-da. And no one's going to know it's the U.S. that's doing it. But he failed. And it was a terrible failure because most of those men died that, had invaded Cuba, tried to take Cuba back. And most of them died. And it was like really a sense of depression in the White House at that time. He then goes on. I have to say, I'm glad I looked down here, that after that, defense spending went up by $3.5 billion. Well, that might be what a plane or two costs today. But at that time, that was money, $3.5 billion. He tripled the number of people, and at that time it was men, being called up for the draft. And he calls up the reserves, and he beefed up the civil defense program. I mean, that's an enormous reaction to this. This is truly, when I try to say to my students, Cold War, this is the Cold War. You know, this is very, very important. He then goes to meet Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union at the time, and so now he goes to meet Khrushchev in June of '61. He's just had this fiasco, really, in Cuba, and Khrushchev's been around. You know, he's gone up through the system. You're really tried and true when you went up through the Soviet system. He sees this little puppy kind of president who's just failed in Cuba. He doesn't know what he's doing. And, you know, Kennedy comes out. There are all kinds of quotes. If you go on to the John F. Kennedy Library website, where I spent quite a bit of time recently preparing for this, you can see, and also the American Experience has a wonderful series on the presidency. You know, you can see some of this. He himself, Kennedy himself says it was a terrible summit meeting that he had. And he was clearly correct, because soon after that, Khrushchev starts putting these missiles into Cuba. Okay, and those of us who have at the time, and my students have heard my reaction to this October 22nd speech that I heard on TV, and they've heard that I was so concerned about, I mean, you really had terror going through you after you heard the speech about Cuba, and these missiles were there, and we're putting in this quarantine, and, you know, this is very serious. He's trying to not only tell the American people this is serious, he's messaging back to the Soviet Union at this time. So I don't know if Khrushchev was nervous. Clearly, we do know he was. But I can tell you, I was very nervous, and I didn't know if I should study for my exam for the next couple of days. Why spend my last 2 days on Earth, you know, studying French? So, but I had faith. I studied. So then, after that, you know, we build up to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, one of the things, I had a little document here, because one of the things I wanted to point out was October 22nd was when I heard about it, but our leaders, including our president, knew about this in July. And I pulled up a document. As I said, I spent some time. Anyhow, it looks like this. You wouldn't be able to read it anyhow. It looked much better. If you have some time to fiddle around and go into the JFK library, lots of documents. And, but the point is, all of a sudden, I'm sitting there last night, I'm saying, what's the date on that? July? I'm worried about it in October, but they were already following this in July. Okay, so our security people certainly knew what was going on. In any case, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, and he's very successful there, right? He is very successful, and eventually Khrushchev is forced out. He's forced out, I think, is it 64, Faina, I think? In any case, he's forced out. The point is, then Kennedy really sobers up, and he goes for a test ban treaty. Now, this is a big deal. If I tell you what it was, you know, and I'm about to do it, they're not going to, you know, we're no longer going to test in the atmosphere. We're not going to test in space. We're not going to test underwater. You know, we have all these, you know, we already have, you know, nuclear weapons. The Soviets already have nuclear weapons, and all we can do is have a test ban treaty. But it was a big deal, because you see how much distrust there was, and where did we fight all this out? Well, we fought all this out not face to face. He was very smart, both Khrushchev and Kennedy. No, we don't take each other on. We came a little too close in Cuba. Everybody saw that. But what happens is that there really are big problems in Berlin. And because what's happening is people from East Berlin, many thousands, are now crossing over with their possessions and moving into West Berlin. Why? Because after World War II, East and West Berlin were split up. In fact, to four parts. Eventually it becomes East and West. But so was Germany. Germany itself was split up, okay, after World War II. So the East Berliners living under Soviet control start walking over to the west side, and nothing's stopping them. So thousands are coming over. And one day, the Berlin Wall starts going up. I'll never forget, hearing this. 1961, up goes that wall. And can you imagine what this meant for people whose families were split? All kinds of things were split. And now here we are. So I want to show you a little bit of how this happens in 1961, and Kennedy doesn't go to Berlin till 1963. But I wanted you to get the sense of Cold War here. I'm going to stop. I was going to show a little more, but I think that we really need to save some time for the Soviet experience here. I just want to say a couple of more things, and they hook into some of the material that Dr. Natoli mentioned. As I'm trying to get across here, once the Soviet Union and the United States came to the brink in Cuba, there was a bit of sobering. But the Cold War-ness didn't stop, as you can hear. I mean, these people in Berlin were desperate to have the support of Kennedy, desperate for the support of General Clay, desperate in face of the Soviet Union. That's how they felt. That's how people felt at that time. They really felt this Cold War. But I want to say that a lot of this these Cold War was played out all over the world. It was played out in Africa. It was played out in Latin America. It was played out in Asia and Vietnam. And I didn't even mention that in Vietnam, Kennedy comes in, there are about 500 troops. That I did mention. He leaves with 15,000 troops in Vietnam. Hey, that's quite an escalation. That's Cold War. There was discussion, and I have a document here that I was going to show you where he's playing with the idea of pulling out 1,000. But he was playing with it because they were going to be replaced by Vietnamese. Okay. And the other document I had that I wanted to put up here, and I'm not going to take the time right now, is that about defoliants. He actually authorized the use of defoliants in Vietnam. Now, what does that mean? These are things like Agent Orange that Vietnamese people were going to live with for ages. Okay, because when you got rid of, they were defoliating trees and all kinds of underbrush so they could fight. But what we're left with afterwards is a Vietnam that has to deal with the health effects of Agent Orange. So this is Cold War, and this is a Cold War president. But he recognized, even before he became president, that it was more than state to state and war to war. And this is where I want to go back to Dr. Natoli's statement. He used the Peace Corps, people to people. Okay, that was the idea. We're going to fight this Cold War people to people. It did two things. It brought the youth of America there to join in with the government and join the fight. Join to build a better country and a better world. And it reached out to people all over the world. And the other very creative program that he instituted was the Alliance for Progress. This was a chip-in program. We'll put in $20 billion, the rest of the people in Latin America, because it was a program for Latin America, you chip in $80 billion. And most of that was supposed to go for social programs and building business and capitalism, okay? And the hopes that the Latin America would democratize. So what we have here, I should say, by the way, under Johnson, more and more of that aid went to military aid. What I really want to leave you with here, I was going to leave you with a quote, but better than that, I think, to leave you to understand that what I've given you was the U.S. side of this Cold War. And I think that Professor Rivkin can give you much more of the understanding of what it was like from the Soviet side. So if I can just...
Thank you. I'm not as knowledgeable about any of accents, probably the most attractive I talk, but I want to make one point and only one point, and that will be from scientific. Sometimes you develop strategy. However beautiful strategy is, occasionally look at your results. And that's what more scientific approach is. In this case, we know the results. It's several firsts. It's Sputnik, as we said. It's development of nuclear weapon, and it's very developed aviation that helped Soviet Union to won Second World War. Three major areas, aviation, rocketry, and nuclear weapon, were developed by three scientists who were severely repressed when they were developing this success. And that is my point. Arms race and holding up an arm in this race, being first in space exploration, development of very threatening weapon, was done in most of the cases by groups that were working in what we call Sharashka now, but it's a slight modification of Gulag, and it was severely politically repressed people. Korolev, that is space exploration, and Tupolev aviation, and Sakharov nuclear weapon, all were working in isolation or house arrest or just in camps. People who were accused by such ridiculous charges as stealing secrets to Americans or French, sabotaging some important patriotic project, used and set in special camps. That was Gulag. That was deep Siberia, deprivation of food and hard labor. In the 50s, they examined the system, and that is statistics that you should process. Soviet Union is a large country. Every 1 out of 50 was suppressed at some extent. They look at this horrible system of Gulag, and they said, look, we have some that can serve us well. Out of Siberia, we will put them somewhere near Moscow. We will allow them a little bit more food and slight communication with their families, and they will produce us what we need. So I'm here to make this point that results are really amazing. First, but the strategy are not. And that citation from what Korolev, the author of Sputnik, recalled. The guard, my dear man, I know you are not guilty of anything.
Get the plane in the air and you will be free. Tarashkas were designed for science. They were isolated and confined areas, and the contrast of what they had in Gulag made them to believe they are very happy in new producing something that was said like that. Catch up and surpass America at any cost. And that was the cost. What they recall in their paper, discoveries in such as nuclear physics, electronics, were published under other scientists' names, published a lot. It was trusted citizen, and it was allowed to get the attention of the journals. They were looking some days on regular prisoners marching to construction site, and they knew that it will be either award or very severe punishment in case of failure. That is the cost of first. Yes, we made our country strong, but at what expense? That is a question.